Yeah, so welcome to our third seminar, which is part of our five series that started some 2 months ago. And our series is called Methodologies in Critical Terrorism Studies, Bridging Disciplinary Gaps and Centering Missing Voices. My name is Samuel, a PhD candidate at National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, University of Otago. And I'm going to be chairing today's event. So I want to thank you all for coming and for joining us. Today's seminar is titled Missing Voices and Methodologies, Decolonization and Indigenous Perspective in Challenging Eurocentricity in CTS. Our next, which will be the fourth event of our series, will take place in January, and we look into blind spots of critical discourse analysis, and it will be chaired by Cloete Auriacombe. Before I introduce today's event, I want to acknowledge the CTS working group, that is Tom Pettinger, Raquel De Silva, and Alice Martini, and also our events coordinator, Eddie Cohen. They've all been really supportive in helping us with this event and the previous ones. At our past events, we already saw some amazing innovative work and discussions on methodologies and political science perspectives. So we hope today we'll continue just those conversations and we move into the colonial and indigenous viewpoints. Thank you all, our wonderful speakers, for agreeing to participate in this event. We're so proud of your input. So this seminar series is the product of an ongoing conversations between initially Alice Finden, Terela Ike, Ugo Gaudino, and myself. And later we were joined by Cloete Auriacombe, and we are all early career and PhD researchers, and we approach the field of CTS from different angles. Combined, our work looks into a variety of different areas, including CTS and political studies, critical approaches such as feminist, decolonial, and postcolonial approaches. But what joins us together is how influential CTS has been over our research, and our interest is asking questions about how CTS envisages diverse methodologies. So in this context, our concern that we all share is over the disciplines, approaches, and forms of knowledge production that CTS engages with less frequently. So these range from terrorism studies and political science, which distinguished scholars, some of whom have been participants in this forum, such as Professor Jackson, Richard Jackson, have noted can end up being generalized as homogeneous or uncritical field. Other approaches we identify as missing out are critical approaches with which CTS engages less, such as the colonial and feminist approaches, and the voices of practitioners who mostly work in less whose work is less engaged with. So we want to know what versions of emancipation such critical approaches have and whether they share the same vision as the CTS project. This seminar series therefore aims to ask questions about how CTS might expand on its work with these areas while simultaneously showing appreciation both for the field and for scholars whose work has inspired us so much. I will therefore introduce into details the organizers. We have Dr. Terela Ike. I'm not sure if she's joined us already, but she's a lecturer in criminology and policing at Teesside University with research interests and specialism in terrorism, counterterrorism, and peace building in post-conflict context. She's also recipient of the 2018 Best Article Award from the British International Studies Association, Royal African Society Postgraduate Prize paper. She has also published in areas concerning reintegration in post-conflict settings and has been involved in research that informs government policies. Then we have Ugo Gaudino, who is a PhD candidate in international relations and a graduate teaching assistant at the University of Kent. Ugo is writing a thesis about securitization of Islam in Western Europe. He looks at how both right and left-wing parties argue that Muslims are a threat to security. In particular, Ugo focuses on counterterrorism discourses and policies. Then we have Alice Finden, who is a PhD candidate at the University of London, looking into coloniality of preemptive counterterrorism and forms of everyday violence. She has peer-reviewed publications with Feminist Review Journal and Australian Feminist Law Journal, and is a co-editor of a special journal issue entitled Hygiene, Coloniality, Law, also with the Australian Feminist Law Journal. She has taught on politics and gender studies modules at SOAS. Then we have Dr. Carlos Yebra, who is a lecturer in Spanish and the first-year seminar program at New York University. In his PhD dissertation, Carlos looks at metaphors we will kill by a critical metaphor analysis of Spanish mass press discourses on jihadist terrorism resistance. He used digital tools to explore the ideological presentations of the notions of democracy, terrorism, and jihad. Carlos will be chairing our fourth event, as I had said earlier, in January 2022. And Samuel Oando, myself, is a PhD candidate at the University of Otago. My thesis focuses on the space of Africa, for African women in tackling violent extremism in Kenya. And mostly I did a book review on radicalization in Pakistan, a critical perspective, and I've published a few articles this year in the Journal of Critical Studies on Terrorism, the African Review Journal, and I've recently also just a month or two ago on new imperialism in counterterrorism, which I submitted to Millennium Journal. So today's seminar opens our conversation about how decolonizing and indigenous perspectives analytically engage with the geopolitical background against which historical events unfold and critically interrogate the hegemonic perspectives from which they are told. Simultaneously, however, there is a tension between the need to adopt a more diverse methodology and the cooptation of the colonial and indigenous knowledge by global North institutions and the wide structures of the academy. Therefore, this panel asks what the colonial and indigenous approaches to CTS might look like and how these respective methodologies can be central in shifting Eurocentric thinking. To respond to these concerns, we have our distinguished panelists who I'm going to introduce next. And we have Professor Cloete Dixit, who is currently working on two related projects, one on far-right extremists, narratives of legitimization in US society, and how far-right violence is normalized, examining specifically the rise of the armed militia movement in the US. Priya is also researching whiteness and white supremacist violence and how it has been made invisible in the study of terrorism and in the meanings of terrorism. She has published on state violence, decolonizing security studies, and research methods in critical terrorism studies. Then we have Dr. Rabea Khan, who is a recent PhD graduate from the University of St. Andrews. Her PhD thesis is entitled The Gendered Coloniality of Religious Terrorism Thesis, a critical discourse analysis of religious labels and their selective use in terrorism studies. Her work is interdisciplinary and brings together the fields of critical terrorism studies and critical religion, utilizing gender and decolonial theory. Rabea has previously published with Critical Research on Religion and is currently working on her first manuscript based on her doctoral thesis, which investigates the colonial origins and function of the popular category religious terrorism in terrorism studies. Third, we have Dr. Aidan North, who is a postdoctoral teaching fellow and researcher at the University of Otago, New Zealand, and a fellow in political science and international relations at the University of To begin, Germany. He has several years of experience working as political advisor and disaster relief coordinator in New Zealand before undertaking his PhD at the NC Parks. His doctoral thesis explored how critical peace scholars contest the discourse of international peace building. He has joined research teams working on pacifism and non-violence, peace building, and the transmission of humanitarian knowledge to indigenous practitioners. He also teaches for classes in peace and conflict studies. And finally, we have Ahmed Bozaid, who is an Egyptian political scientist holding masters in international relations from the University of Aberdeen, and now finishing his PhD at Hunter Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence in University of St. Andrews. Ahmed has published 6 books in Arabic and more than 70 peer-reviewed papers in both English and Arabic journals. His first English monograph on counterterrorism strategies in Egypt is forthcoming with the Root-Rich Critical Terrorism Studies series, and his other book entitled Theories on International Relations and the Study of Arab Uprisings is under contract with Syracuse University Press. Then our discussion for the day is Dr. David Mwambari, who is a lecturer in African Security and Leadership Studies at the African Leadership Center. He was an MRI fellow at Codestria, by fellow at Churchill Cambridge University, assistant professor at USIU Kenya, and a faculty of the Oxford Consortium for Human Rights, University of Oxford. He has published articles in various platforms, both academic and non-academic, and David's research seeks to contribute to 3 broad areas. 1 is leadership, peace building, and security studies, and 2 focuses on the politics, knowledge of production in sensitive contexts, including contribution to the decolonization of research methods and debates, and 3, memory politics. His work has won various awards as well, including the Nancy Mills Award. David has also done many consultancies and led projects around the world. So I take this opportunity to welcome you all again, and our guiding questions for the panel we had already shared with the panelists, and so I would want to welcome our first speaker, Priya, to open for us the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invite as well, for the very generous introduction. And I think I'm going to have more questions than answers in this 10 minutes. I'll start, and I redid the question slightly, and I'm answering it to an extent in the form of talking about some of my own experiences with research methods in critical terrorism studies, and trying to get to some of the questions that that you all very nicely sent us, starting with the question of where I work. And I think looking around and at your introductions just now as well, one of the few that work in the US and use what we might call critical terrorism methods. And I think there's a broader question to be asked about what does that then mean about the practices of terrorism and counterterrorism and how we study it. But more specifically, in my case, I work in a university which is a land grant university, which I think many of us are familiar with, which I suppose would be better said as land appropriated or land taken university, in an area of the country that has been settled by Scots-Irish people who had been initially fleeing their own oppressive state and religious institutions, but then became part of this state and religious institutions once they were here in the United States. It's also an area where the original inhabitants, the indigenous communities, we rarely hear from them or about them. They're not reflected in the university, which has over 30,000 people. So it's a large public university in the US. It's not reflected in the names of the halls and the areas around the university, most of whom are named, some of whom are named after people who went to war in the name of the United States, or people who are even in the Confederate Army in the United States, because this place used to be a military institution, a military academy before, until fairly recently. So we don't hear from the people who were displaced and removed. And I think there are parallels here to how we study terrorism and how we do research on terrorism, which gets to questions 1 and 2 about how we do our research on terrorism, and also what's the role of the academy, which in this. And I think from where I'm working, most of us around this roundtable, and in general, in how we do research, are from specific backgrounds which reflect this particular type of experience to some extent. And most of our labor and our work rests upon people who are often unacknowledged and unseen. And I'm not sure whether we've even, I'm not talking about we as in like the people around this screen who might be more, but a general we to some extent. I'm not sure whether we've acknowledged this or dealt with this tension very much at all. And I think this narrative of where I work also, to some extent, leaves out that Appalachia, which is the region where I am, also has a history of solidarities across races that doesn't often get talked about very much in US history or US politics or discussions about this area. It does have histories of solidarities with people who are, fighting oppressive structures of power, especially labor movements. That doesn't get talked about very much. And I think one of the things that I've started thinking about more broadly is how would it be to kind of question the colonial foundations of the university, but also think a bit about collaboration and whether there are these moments in histories that exist that we could talk about a bit more. And I believe some of you do much better job in this than I would. So how would that be? So that's one of the overall theme that I had here. The second is the question of who I am, moving from where I work to who I am. I'm from Nepal. I have a Nepali passport, and it's fairly obvious when I travel, but other times it's hard to tell, I think, for many people. And what I mean by that is I've lived abroad half my life. I've studied in educational institutions abroad most of my life, especially higher education. And I'm part of these systems of power that it is what has made me who I am now, I think. So knowledge production, in this sense, especially in the US, I think in the US political science context, which is where I work, it has to fit, in my view, it always had to fit within certain agreed upon concepts or norms. And there's also this view, which I think is a somewhat similar immigrant view in many cases, that I didn't want to rock the boat, as it were, didn't want to question, especially when I was first starting. And people were telling you, well, you can't really do this kind of research because, you were already you're already kind of from the outside. So let's keep things less controversial. And especially in the early days of being the US, this was very much a story I was told. And there was not much openings for discussing race and security, race and terrorism, especially in the US academic context when I first started here. And oftentimes, and even now, I complied. I didn't really want any hassle. Like right now, I'm teaching classes that have people from a far right student organization in class. And I realized I censor myself even when teaching because I don't want the hassle. I live in a small town. Everybody kind of knows where I am. And, it's less trouble that way. And I think about what this has left out and how I've continued the same structures in some ways that I'm talking about here. And the questions you had, like, it was just before the start of our Thanksgiving break, and I was sitting there looking at them and going, in a way, I've become the institution in so many ways here in the US, just because I don't want to create a fuss, if you want to put it that way. And I looked at my own syllabi, especially in the early years, and I taught what I'd been taught in the US because I started thinking, well, they need to know about these real debates, and they need to know about these ways in which Americans talk about some of these things. US Americans, being like US political science, talks about some of these things, because otherwise they'll feel as left out and as marginalized as I often felt out trying to do this kind of stuff here. And I think that's a conversation that most of you will never face, because I presume there's a lot more space for critical research in your areas, but here it's still very, very much the case. And I often wonder what decolonization thinking does, what this kind of thinking does, and how decolonization might be able to kind of address some of the questions that I have myself. And thinking about collaborations, like how does that work when we're not speaking, when the terms of collaboration are maybe not the same? And the last thing I'm going to say, sorry, 10 minutes, I realize. Last thing I'm going to say is what I do. So where I work, who I am, and what I do. As I said, I teach at a university that still considers itself a military academy. So it's one of the 6 military academies in the United States. I teach classes on terrorism and counterterrorism, far-right violence in the US, and national security to ROTC, which is Reserve Officer Training Corps cadets. And this semester in my terrorism counterterrorism course, I have like a small group of people from this far-right organization, and about 95% of people who are in ROTC and who are very eager, but who are very not interested in learning about, maybe the US hasn't been great in all this stories of terrorism and counterterrorism. And in that case, I teach in a country where, look at the news from the last week. It was hard to kind of look at it and have people in class going, well, I think it's perfectly okay to bring this machine gun to it's in our Second Amendment right. So it's hard to kind of talk and teach in the context where a lot of the ways in which they think about the world is already fairly set at the age of 18, which is a bit shocking to me, especially in the context of like the last week's news and anyway. And we can say, I think, to some extent that academia is product of coloniality in all our countries. But is it to some extent the US also perhaps at an extreme? And I was outside the US for the start of the pandemic last year. And yeah, I was outside for most of 2020. And it was really interesting to me seeing some of these issues from outside the US and then thinking, oh, well, this is what's going to lead to accountability. This is what leads to change. And then seeing nothing has changed. Like the police are being funded more, the protests didn't really change very much. And if part of our goal is decolonizing, then how in a place where institutions and oppressive structures of power seem to have such a hold? And it was, how do you decolonize or decenter in this particular context where processes that produce insecurity and terrorism are for many people are things that others won't even acknowledge is happening as reality? And I don't know. And I think that's a fairly depressing place to finish it, but I want to maybe take a minute to talk about something that some of you have heard in different contexts. So one of the things I'm doing right now is trying to look at scholarship in abolitionist studies, Black feminist scholarship, and in anarchist studies to talk about whether we could prefigure how we would want to see research and probably our lives as well in terms of how that might connect with goals of decolonizing, and what would a prefigurative politics of decolonizing in universities, but also in our studies and in our work looks like. And we could say it might look partly like this at the moment, but also looking at the abolitionist works of scholars like Angela Davis and Ruth Gilmore in the US and others overseas to talk a bit more about what a collaborative liberatory world where people facing terrorism are the ones who are centered to some extent, and some of these questions are talked about a bit more, would look like, and whether we can ensure our research and our work accordingly. I realize this is a lot of fragments and not much sense making, and I thank you for your intelligence and your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Cloete Dixit, for your good comment. Can we now have to hear from Rabea?
Right. Yeah. So thank you very much, first off, to the organizers for inviting me and for organizing this panel. This is a really great session to be a part of. And thank you, Priya, for your thoughts. I saw myself in a lot of what you said, especially with regards to censoring yourself and not wanting to rock the boat too much. So I do see myself in that a lot. And it's one of the tensions I'm struggling with in the academy. And I'm sure a lot of you do too. So what I want to do today, I'm going to reflect on the purpose of researching terrorism and counterterrorism for me as a CTS scholar with a decolonial mission. That's how I would identify myself as a CTS scholar. And my entry point into this conversation is my own work and the decolonial approach that I've used or that I've tried to use, and the tensions that I felt in employing or trying to employ such an approach. So basically in my recent PhD thesis, and as Sam has introduced my work so kindly, thank you very much, Sam. It was entitled The Gendered Coloniality of the Religious Terrorism Thesis. So I was using a decolonial approach, but it wasn't, and what I would now refer to it as a so-called soft decolonial approach. And that means it wasn't a strict or a radical decolonial approach. And that's because I don't think, and I don't know how this would be possible in a discipline like ours. So a really strict decolonial approach, in my understanding, and maybe also according to the majority of decolonial scholars, would involve a proper delinking. And that means not using or engaging with literature that is building on colonial knowledge and that is using colonial tropes and colonial language. But that is the very literature that critical terrorism studies has to engage with, because it is CTS's mission, really, right? Or its original mission, as I understand it, it emerged as a response to the very colonial discipline, i.e. terrorism studies, mainstream terrorism studies, and it emerged to make a difference and provide a counterpole to the harmful and the biased and the Eurocentric research that mainstream terrorism was producing and continues to produce. So that's the first tension right there. Terrorism studies is colonial. CTS needs to respond to that, is responding to it. So it needs to engage with a colonial discipline. And a radical decolonial approach, in my understanding, would refrain from engaging in the first place, right? And a really strict decolonial approach would also not be using, for example, some of the critical theories and thinkers and thought that we consider to be critical, such as, for example, post-structural theory. And it is something that I have used in my thesis because I did, first off, it's very accessible, it was available to me, and I did find it useful in my mission, this decolonial mission that I had, right? And that's how I framed my research. It was a research project with a decolonial mission. And that means I'm not claiming that it's the best decolonial approach, or even that it's a proper decolonial approach or a strict decolonial approach, or that I'm decolonizing anything, because that would be a very ambitious claim, first off. And then I'm also very wary of using this language, decolonizing, but I'll get to that in a bit. So the approach that I'm using is one whose main mission is to uncover coloniality and colonial structures. So I see it as my purpose in terrorism studies to uncover some of the colonial origins and the structures and the language that would otherwise go unnoticed, I would say, if it wasn't analyzed with a specifically decolonial mindset, if that makes sense. And what I mean very quickly with coloniality, so I'm referring to very simply to the racist and colonial logic, and which is part of the intellectual and structural foundation or foundations of Western civilization that have enabled the activity of colonialism, but they have both preceded it and they succeeded until today. So it's not colonialism that I'm concerned with in my research, it's coloniality. So I call, and it's basically the colonial logic that enabled this discourse in terrorism studies, in mainstream terrorism studies that we now see. So I call my own approach to studying and researching terrorism decolonial in that sense, because I'm concerned with that coloniality. And that means I seek to uncover the coloniality upon which the discourse on terrorism is built and within whose structures it operates. And that includes CTS, right? And I strongly believe that thinking more along decolonial lines is absolutely essential, and you could argue overdue in CTS. And it's not already covered under the so-called critical approach, or can be covered under that approach. It needs to be more explicitly, or it needs to be more explicit in how it's also, right, looking at it from a more decolonial perspective. Yeah, and that's because I think there are a couple of problems with CTS that CTS still needs to address. and I'm going to give a couple that I addressed in my PhD thesis. So what I did there is I conducted a discourse analysis of almost 300 articles across the 4 major terrorism journals. So that was Terrorism and Political Violence, TPV, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, then Perspectives on Terrorism, and also our journal, Critical Studies on Terrorism. And what I found then, obviously, was a huge difference in the language employed if you compare critical and mainstream terrorism studies, but not so much in the topics discussed. All right. And consequently, then, I also found that CTS was not completely free from colonial biases that can be detected in language. And I'm not exempting myself here. That is part of the tension I encounter when using or trying to use a decolonial approach in our discipline. And this is also partly because, and as I've said before, we are only responding, CTS is basically only responding to the colonial and the Orientalist discourse that traditional terrorism studies has established. So a gap, I would say, in CTS is that CTS needs to look at the colonial knowledge and the foundation and the colonial origins that has made this discourse, the discourse that we are now responding to, possible in the first place, right? So basically what I'm saying is that we need to dig deeper. And the problem with CTS that I see also, and I wrote about this in my recent reflection piece with CTS, is that it is caught in a constant sort of what I would refer to as a counter discourse. And that makes sense. And it's not exclusively a bad thing, I'm not saying that, but there are problems that come with it that needs to be acknowledged. So at best, I would say this sort of counter discourse unintentionally confirms this dominant discourse, or it gives it validity, and at worst, it reproduces it. And this is what I see as the problem, for example, with CTS's focus on countering neo-Orientalism or Islamophobia. If you do a quick survey of just how many articles of our journal use the term Islam or Muslim, and therefore basically put it in connection with terrorism, unintentionally so. But if you compare that to how often TPV, for example, and Studies in Conflict and Terrorism use the term, then quite surprisingly, we use it even more, it seems, right? And so it actually seems like those journals, the traditional ones, the oldest ones who have been producing the dominant and colonial discourse, they also have much more freedom in what they want to say and how they want to say it and when they want to say it. And we are still kind of stuck, and we are much more restrained by having to respond to whatever discourse they choose to produce next, basically. So ultimately, CTS still hasn't managed to really radically depart from the dominant discourse, which I think is something that we should be talking about in terms of what are the next steps for CTS and what's our mission in the future. So something that we should have a conversation about. How could this look like if we carved out our own space that is not dependent on what mainstream terrorism studies produces? And is that even possible at all? Because I'm quite pessimistic when it comes to that question. So to wrap this up, I do believe we need to look at how we can employ decolonial approaches, but at the same time, we also need to be really careful with the language we use and how we frame this. I love that we are thinking about and having a conversation about decoloniality, but I would hate if we become one more of those Western research communities that use the term decolonization too liberally and as a metaphor. Because quite simply put, decolonization is the actual return of land to indigenous people, and it involves reparations and an end to settler colonialism and an end to occupation. And we shouldn't then be so freely using the term in the academy in terms of, for example, what I come across a lot is this phrase, let's decolonize the curriculum, right? But actually what is meant with that is let's diversify the curriculum. It's not the same thing. And it wouldn't do it just as if we are using the term, and because it would come very close to co-opting the term and where this movement comes from in the first place. So what I would say CTS needs to also do is recognize its limits. And we, as researchers, more generally need to recognize our limits in the academy more generally. And that's also something that Priya was talking about, right? At the end of the day, we still need to write academically and for the academy. And I recently saw this tweet by a person on Twitter called Razan Razawi, and he said something along the lines of academic writing is always limiting. And I think this is especially true for anyone writing with a decolonial mission. We are very limited with such a mission. We still write within the limits of it and within the limits of the academy and the neoliberal university, and we cannot be completely free from colonial restraints and the scrutiny of our work, especially in CTS. So maybe the task of CTS in the future is to, well, negotiate how they can provide a platform for anyone that wants to, well, conduct research with a decolonial mission, and how to maybe, well, remove some of those restraints. So to really wrap this, can I wrap very quick? So I do believe CTS needs to engage with a decolonial mission if it wants to stay relevant and if it wants to continue to be truly critical in that sense. But I don't believe that it can or should try to decolonize. And I do feel that as a field, we might have to think about the purpose for studying terrorism, counterterrorism, and we need to incorporate and encourage decolonial efforts without co-opting them. And crucial for that, sorry, my last point, crucial for that is that CTS recognizes its own limits and how it is still writing from within a modern colonial Western inheritance, and it will continue to do so, right? So yeah, I'm going to end here. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing everyone's thoughts on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert, for a wonderful discussion and good insights. Yes, we move now to Dr. Aidan North from the south.
Sometimes from the south, sometimes from the north. Thank you. South geographically. Sorry, I realize now what you're getting at. It's a bad way to start. Yeah, okay, I've just popped you all up there. So I've got a bit of a presentation, but thank you all for having me. Some really interesting discussions there, especially the last one there. I think there's a lot of points that I agree with. Some points that I'm a little confused with myself personally. I really feel like when Sam asked me to present on this, he really just wanted me to have an existential crisis and sort of, get a white person to come along and speak on decolonization. And so I have no intent on really overstepping my boundaries there. What I would like to talk about is a bit of my own sort of research that I did in the broader field of critical peace research. And I see a lot of overlaps with critical terrorism studies. But primarily, I want to sort of problematize the rationales underpinning, I guess, what we would call an ontopolitical challenge right now. And especially within my own sort of positionality. And I really want to touch on a few of academia's institutional barriers, which I feel limit criticality more generally and emancipatory research more generally, not just sort of this drive for decolonizing particular agendas or particular methods. And just sort of have a wee bit of a challenge about what it is that we can do about that. If I can figure out how to hit the next slide, I will use some sort of oversimplified typical binaries just for the purposes of time. So apologies if terms like global south, global north need to be contested a little bit more deeply. What I think is really interesting is there's a lot of research presentations and slides and literatures and calls for decolonizing particular spaces within academia. And they're all sort of coalescing around very similar rationales. But quite a few of them are also being driven by, white privileged older males in the global north who are sort of, in a sense, very have benefited from these institutions for a long time. So in one way, there is this benevolent push, which is good, but there's also a deeper rationale, which some critical scholars like Chandler and Reed and Bruno Latour and things are pointing to, which is that the turn to the local or the increasing desire to study subaltern or decolonial or other populations it's not remotely new, but there is a noted sort of urgency at the moment which to sort of some critical theorists has been motivated by the ongoing climate crisis and the need to sort of overcome these problems where indigenous and decolonial spaces are seen to be able to do that by challenging modernity and the European ontologies and epistemologies. So in this light, the decolonial push is an attempt to challenge the modernist or Western divisions of nature and culture, hierarchical understandings of cultural indifference, and linear and problematic conceptions of time, space, and the marginalization of colonial histories and political subjects. So to some, the rationales for the shift may be inconsequential, as they could produce the same ends, but it is a different rationale than what other people are calling for this decolonial or decolonization of CTS, which is that racist narrative, the gendered narratives, and these other sort of aspects, which sort of fall into ultimately the same objective, but for different rationales. I think that we really have to be careful about what those rationales are, or why we're seeking to decolonize things. The last few decades have cautioned our shifts to the local and the post-colonial subject, which have been drawn on by both researchers and policymakers alike to co-opt, extract, and occasionally erase indigenous knowledges in an attempt to extend regimes of neoliberal governance through international state and peace-building efforts. As argued by Elisa Randazzo, turning to indigeneity without questioning the impact of liberal peace thinking might further elicit marginalization and appropriation and simply save liberal peace efforts through the back door. So ultimately, there's not one rationale or call to decolonize CTS or peace studies or IR, but there's many. And I guess for more alarmist scholars, and I would probably include myself here, I wonder the extent to which these ideas are being sought to save the West, or whether or not it's to assist the West in its continual project of saving the rest through sort of this neoliberal international governance platform. So for some of my research, I'd just like to draw on a little bit the first problem I wanted to talk about was the makeup of academia itself, its membership and the logics and norms which sort of govern it, which we've already sort of spoken to a little bit, so I'll try and be brief. But to give you a bit of context, I conducted a critical discourse analysis in a series of interviews with 111 prominent critical peace scholars writing on what I would consider to be the adjacent field of CTS. And I used key critical terminology such as decolonial, post-colonial, indigenous, local, and references to identify publications which were then verified through a bibliometric analysis. In this, I scrutinized over 600 articles published in the field of critical peace building. And here I could sort of see how the membership of the field directly impacted on the types of knowledge. So similar to the last presentation in the last critical discourse analysis, the language can change, but the themes stay very similar, which I thought was quite interesting. So within my data set, and I recognize that it's somewhat anecdotal, there were 71 men, 40 women, 103 resided within the global north at the time of writing, so at the time of their publications and things, which I think brings in notions of Bordeaux and habitus and what that sort of does to our ability to contest and really decolonize ourselves. For research output, some 470 articles out of the, I think it was about 650 that I analyzed. Some 470 articles were published in Northern Europe, while only 40 were published within the global south. Why this matters, well, existing research has shown that Northern institutions and funding agencies set the agendas and the rules of the game, then work with those who have similar goals and mindsets in the North. So we create this sort of epistemic closure. Not only are the global south publications substantially underrepresented, but funding limitations cause scholars to focus on teaching at the expense of new research. A review of the North-South divisions by Pamela Scully noted that the ability of global South scholars to tap into global discussions is limited by insufficient resources and their focus on short-term, contextually driven problem solving, which is of little interest to global North scholarship and its need for theory. Basically, the issue here is that there are different rationales for why we undertake research in the first place. And when we become part of academia, we all have to play the game. And the publications which are produced primarily in the North have a very different rationale, and they always want this significant theoretical contribution, etc., which other scholars and things aren't necessarily so interested in because they have this context or practice-oriented need to challenge and discuss and provide new solutions. This isn't to say that Northern scholars are complicit entirely in the deliberate subjugation of alternative voices. For we too are bound by neoliberal institutions. We face funding issues which prevent us from developing relationships or having face-to-face discussions and building new mechanisms. We've still got the same quest for tenure with peer review incentives, privileging research with theoretical contributions over the expense of more practical bents. But I think that the pressures are obviously significantly different, and I really don't think that many within in the North sort of that come from these positions of privilege can have a leg to stand on when considering sort of these different researchers in different spaces that don't have the same accesses and primarily funding. Even just things like citation patterns. So I'm not sure if you guys have heard of Lotka's law or Bradford's law, but there are sort of in bibliometric studies, these sort of 80 to 20% divides where 20% of academics will publish 80% of the articles, or 20% of the journals that are prestigious will publish 80% of the sort of primary articles. And then basically there's just all these inbuilt, ingrained and entrenched divisions within academia, which continue to privilege particular scholars and particular voices over others, which, you know, are insanely difficult to change from the outside, insanely difficult to change when you're not a editor or on a critical journal that you can actually actively influence who's getting in and who's getting published. But even when we are allowing for those changes to occur, there's still this sort of entrenched coloniality where if it doesn't have the same theoretical contribution that we want in an academic article, we'll put it in its own separate spot, such as letters from the field or an op-ed, or we'll change the style of that article so it doesn't have the same weight that a normal article might. In terms of how that emerges in terms of research barriers, I guess it's sort of difficult to understand the precise impact that these patterns and biases have. And even when scholars make deeper efforts to more critically engage in their subject areas, there are severe limits to how this is undertaken. Interdisciplinary divisions prevent the transmission of ideas, where the sheer amount of research, limited time of scholars, and need to partake in hot topic debates prevents a deeper scrutinization and reflection, allowing for discussions to be continually replicated across fields as they're slowly picked up by scholars. While these debates such as ontopolitics can be ongoing, others such as hybridity and friction and these other sort of critical terms have been used and already debated to death 40 years ago in other fields. And I think that's something that we need to be aware of when we're saying sort of decolonizing CTS or putting in a particular spin or angle, is that quite often these discussions have happened in another part of academia already, and generally to quite a significant extent. That doesn't mean revisiting them isn't necessary, but quite often a lot of the publications that are generated simply are really just applying a new framework or a new lens. And within my own research, I noticed this around primarily around the topic of hybridity and friction, where you'd have new publications within the space of a year and a half, which are saying pretty much exactly the same thing, but they're just using this new term. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I didn't see the.
Can't we just? Yep.
I'll just wrap up. Yes. Okay. Sorry, I didn't see your flag. But basically, I just wanted to argue really: is decolonizing enough, or do we need to more radically challenge CTS to draw on pacifist and gendered notions? And to this end, I would say that scholars like myself really need to take up the mantle in terms of critiquing the systems and the broader institution of which we are a part, and perhaps have the privilege of being able to take down. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for great insights. We move now to our last presenter, Ahmed. Welcome.
Thank you, Sam. If you just feel to stop me talking, please do that, because yeah, I have the reputation.
I will.
Yeah. Can I share my screen? Sorry. Can you see it now, no?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much, Alice, Sam, and the rest of the team for inviting me. And it was really nice to see Professor Bateya and our good friend, Dr. Rabia as well. It's really a pleasure to be with you here today. Before I will start, I can't overlook that this is an opportunity to share this statement with solidarity with 6 Palestinian human rights organization that now under the repression of the Israeli government. I will be grateful if you can sign it. If it's not already, you sign it and share it with your colleagues. That would be really help us pushing forward such decolonizing practices in real life and in academia as well. As for today, I am starting with, since Alice and Samuel kindly approached me to reflect about this title, Missing Voices, and it's really stuck with me for a while. And I just can't escape it. It's not missing. It was suppressed. It was silent. It was pushed away from the mainstream or the canonical debate. So I'm starting from this point. It's not missing, it's there, and it's always there, but had been systematically, institutionally, had been pushed away and suppressed. And I'm starting from a very, very famous quote we all know of Audre Lorde about the master tools will never dismantle the master house. And we are looking for this marginalized or suppressed voices. So it's not a missing voices, it's the voices of the victims and those who had been suppressed. And in a way, it's a kind of epistemic, what Kate Doston call it, it's epistemic oppression or epistemic violence that excludes and hinder one contribution of knowledge production from other people. And because it's challenging and disturbing and contest the dominant knowledge productions. So these are the voices of the victims, the oppressed, and those who rebelled both epistemically and practically against all form of repressive power, domination, colonialism, and or other form of oppression. So today I will try to talk about it as not only a political statement or a political resistance, but also and above all as a form of epistemic disobedience, to use Fanon or Walter Menlo words, against that kind of epistemic oppression and epistemic violence. So I am not interested in going on with the debate about decoloniality, the essence of decoloniality, what exactly decoloniality. Rabia make it very difficult to add something which was what she kindly mentioned about what is essence of decoloniality. But if I can add it something with what Bateya and Rabia said, this is what I believe it a radical intervention, or if Rabia used soft decoloniality, this is a radical radicality or radical engagement with decolonization. This is a kind of, I'm sorry, because of the time, I just try to escape some of the presentation. I will be happy if anyone wanted, I will share it with you. So this kind of voices, what Larry Peterson called different voices from the margins, regarding voices, interpretation, could expand our understanding of the world and change it eventually. So again, I will refer, sorry for that, I will refer to what Bateya said. She lived under system of oppression differently. And this is really what stuck me with my new book about what happened when a researcher, because we keep talking about decoloniality and repression and terrorism, and we forget that some of us, many of us, potentially or just coincidence, they were a victim as well. So how we as a researchers will deal with such experience of violence over state violence. So, and also the rigidity of the discipline itself. So in my book, I try to escape that by going beyond the rigidity of not only terrorism study, but also political science, Middle Eastern studies, and international relations. So I try to use historical sociology and different sociology methods like autobiography, auto-analysis, short stories, and even creative writing. Like, so I revisited my own experience for more than 20 years in Egypt, in Upper Egypt, where counter-terrorism measures taken place or took place since the late 80s when I was a kid and a teenager before I have to leave Egypt 2008. So I try to revisit that by writing in my book. I wrote 6 or 7 short stories and overlap and intersect with the topic I'm talking about, which is counter-terrorism and state violence. So overall, this presentation today is a part of ongoing project, which I will carry on after my PhD in Columbia University with a program called Exiting Violence, about the entanglement of imperial histories of decolonizing knowledge on Middle East, IR, terrorism study, and almost everything, as Rebecca Monteza, really very good and highly recommended podcast called Decolonizing Everything. So my questions, or what's talking with me after Alice and Sam invited me. So I asked myself, what should we do where archive is either absent or inaccessible? Because, for example, many of us, especially from the global south, with authoritarian regimes like Egypt, Syria, and many others, I can't go to the archive. And this is the main peril of modern knowledge. You conduct archival research, I can't go to the archive. So what can I do? What should I do instead of the archival one? The other question was, what should we do with fabricated or biased former archives as well? Like I just watched a documentary from GDR, former Germany, Eastern Germany, about how the police fabricated the archive itself. So how can we judge that this archive is reflecting the truth or the facts or what really happened? And the third one was how to study the history of state violence from above, not only everything against the state or the resistance from below. And last one, but not least, can global histories be studied without the West or without the colonial lens? So I am trying to explore different methods here, different methodology, creative history, fragments of memory, literature, and aesthetic and visual arts. So, for example, and I will, sorry, Sam, I will escape it now, and you can see, like, for example, this literature fiction as a source in Egypt, for example, because I'm tracing the colonial and post-colonial legacies. I can't find only one source, but really literature and fiction have, especially historical fiction, have really rich sources that you can use it. Like this one is about the last Mamluki families, the second one about Napoleon and about resistance during the 18th, 19th century. The last one on the right, it's about a rebellion against the Abbasid Caliphate in 8th century, which you can't find it in the archive if you don't have access. And the other one is subaltern text and autobiography, not only from the perspective of global south, but also from the soldier in something like Napoleon campaign. Like this one, I have many sources about soldiers and subaltern taken a part of this campaign, and they rebel against the formal Napoleonic narrative about what exactly the campaign was about, and all this narrative about bringing enlightenment and civility and civilization to the Orient, which was not true. So the overall, the main purposes of this alternative or marginalized methodologies is to dismantle how system of power, either Western or non-Western, framed, dehumanized, demonized, and misrepresented the others. Like, for example, the visual and aesthetic. Look at this contrast. For example, like this is a very organized photo for Napoleon campaign. And this is how the Orient or Egyptian look like: Mamluki, dark, dusty, desert, camels, very Orientalist. We need to revisit this because not everyone, it will be wrong to assume that everyone knows this narrative. Everyone know what beyond this great paintings that you saw it in the British galleries or the Louvre or the New York Museum or elsewhere. This is the Cairo campaign. We don't know what exactly happened here, but it's just the pyramids and the Nile and the palm and stuff. This is how the Egyptian look like on the left hand, and this is how Napoleon looked like. This is how the French as well. Look at the lights, look at the faces of the Mamluks or the Egyptian. Look at how Napoleon as well look at the very dark side of the Egyptian and misery, and look how Napoleon in the middle of the mosque, and the way they dress and the way Egyptians dress or non-dress in this case. To remember, of course, Edward Said famous cover of Orientalism. And so I have my case study is the story of Sulaiman al-Halabi. Sulaiman al-Halabi is the Egyptian Syrian student who was accused of killing Kleber, the commander of Napoleon campaign in Egypt. And he was tortured and executed in public, despite all narrative of modernity and a modern justice system and representation of the victims or the convicted, blah, blah, blah. So this is what Napoleon said about the campaign. And actually these sources, this is French sources, really documented how Napoleon and the French army suppressed the, the contested narrative about what exactly the campaign was about. So just to move on, this is again, sorry, it's this is the case about Sulaiman al-Halabi, and also this is one of the things that had been portrayed during the campaign or during the trial as well. And this is one of the modern sources of justice that Napoleon bring into Egypt, and with all procedures and all justice, legal order or code. And in the end, al-Halabi was finally convicted and implemented in, I can't use the photo here because it's inhuman, in public, and his body had been lifted for 3 days. For the last point, this was in 1802. Interestingly, this is still what the critical realism calls the presence of the past. This is still tension between France and Algeria, for example. This names is from 2016, and this is the skulls of the rebels and people who resist against the French, like Sulaiman al-Halabi. Their skulls had been cut off, send it to what they call it in France, the Museum of Humans. And this is 16,000 skulls still demonstrated in exhibition, labeled as criminal, as murders, as terrorists. So this is not new narrative. This is something we need to revisit this one. And this is also another very different case from India. This is a very brilliant book about one of the soldiers in the rebellion of 1857 and how this represents the British occupation of India. The last two points, I'm really sorry, Sam, how this help, because it's not enough to just critique with C, not with Q. So what exactly, how can we push it forward? So there's new alternatives, imaginary, creative, we need to revisiting, re-examining and re-evaluating the legacies of post-colonial and colonial, anti-colonial and decolonial legacies in the global South. And as I mentioned before, critical is not the enemy, or critical terrorism study is not the bad guys. Actually, it's a value, it's an asset for us, but we need to push it forward. This is what I call it the D-turn. So it's really like everything, it's decolonizing everything, it's de-westernizing, it's de-linking, as Rabia said, with colonial.
Unfortunately, I have to stop you now, Ahmed. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. Thanks. So now we want to move into to have our discussant, David Mombari, to join us with what he has picked up and what he may want us to know into details. Then afterwards, we will open the question and answer session. So, Dr. Mombari.
Well, thank you very much, Sam, and thank you very much, everybody who presented. I want to also thank our audience and the invitation that has been extended to me. In this conversation that I'm going to have with you, I am going to outline first a few themes, if you want, that I've heard that emerged from different presentations. And the second, I will give my own reflection on the general topic of decolonization and generally terrorism or security studies. So one is really generally we had quite a bit about positionality. I think it's almost every presenter who touched on either questions they are faced with their work or the different dilemmas they face because of their varied positionality. And I am mindful that perhaps in our audience, people might not have reflected much on positionality itself or what some scholars write on reflexive thinking. And this has to do with generally an understanding of where you stand intellectually or as a person or as the person producing knowledge to the knowledge being produced or to the research being carried out. Generally, I would say, you know, it could be helpful that way to think about inside a positionality, outside the positionality, and that exists on a spectrum, and it is malleable, it changes over time, over spaces, depending on the study, depending on what you're working on. And there's a lot of literature I would encourage you to look at on the positionality. The second theme I heard has to do with institutional histories and barriers, I would call it that. The fact that as scholars, even who are reflecting on decolonization, as scholars who are thinking about these ideas on what to do with the Eurocentric approaches to terrorism studies or other studies that we carry out or disciplines we belong to, that there is an issue of a container, that these are contained institutions, that they are contained in particular institutions that have particular histories, and that powerful gatekeepers, you know, want to sustain in a particular way, and therefore overlapping with the question of positionality, if we are entrenching or supporting those same institutions, or how to resist some of these ideas that are guarding those institutional histories and barriers. And then there is another theme I picked up on that was discussed quite a bit on the fluidity of the term decolonization, how different people want to deploy it in different conversation, different literature, and different approaches. So what is, you know, decolonization, and the fact that we can also negate the fact that also people can let it go easily or strategically make it useless in academia because of certain powers that has to be protected. So I also picked up that theme. And then there was actually less presentation on the missing voices, though everybody sort of touched on it. But the last presenter is really the one who outlined for us who are these people without power. To some extent, you know, there was always a discussion on that. But here in the last presentation, we really had an almost pointing to the people. I think Fanon calls them the rest of the earth. And so that was very helpful. And that's something we could probably talk about more. The second thing that that emerged for me in the last presentation that had been touched on earlier is an issue to do with styles. Are we confined? It was almost a question, are we confined by particular formats, particular ways of writing, particular ways of producing knowledge in terrorism studies for us to be accepted, for us to have jobs, for us to have acceptance from colleagues, for us to contribute to the debate? And again, here I appreciate this pointing to the possibilities of creative writing, artistic expression, terminologies, vocabulary. Somebody mentioned languages. Who do we actually call a terrorist? And recently there was, of course, a debate, and I think a shift in debate with the incident or the attack in the US Capitol. Even the media and other big powerful institutions, without them starting to use language different. And I think even the United States president, where we feel like a power of coloniality might be sitting at different times of the debate. So on that point, I would say those are the themes I picked up. There might have been more, but I wanted to really just point out a few of them given the time I have. So positionality, institutional history and the barriers, different ways of understanding decolonization, the missing voices that without power, and styles of conveying or producing knowledge. Now, in the few minutes that I still have remaining, I'm hoping that basically questions will come about this, and then we can continue to unpack. There were many examples given. I really appreciate the richness of examples that different presenters gave, either from their own positionality, from their own research, from their own ways they conducted research. I would have, one would have wanted to hear more about methodological approaches to those projects. For instance, I will discuss briefly on this idea of working within the confines of the colonial library. I think one presenter pointed out, X amount of these articles came from here, and others came from here. And there was a question there that even if you want to divide this geographically, if even the global south, you not find eurocentric ideas circulating, of course you will. The same way you might find decolonizing ideas circulating in the north. So let me just give my own brief reflections on other areas that I thought would have been that can be brought about in questions. Well, one is that for me, I like to take this decolonization debates in different disciplines, and this in particular, in this case, in terrorism studies or security studies, from historical approaches. And a historical approach allows me, or allows those of us who are studying this, not to run out of breath. And what I mean is that we are going to when one looks at the history of decolonization, whether at a political project or as an epistemic project, in different parts of the world, we see that there are different moments when the debate sort of surges, and there's a debate. There is like a volume that is increased on those debates, and the questioning of power sort of has a visibility in the media, in the ways we live, in the ways we are. And I think, I don't know where we are at the moment globally, but definitely, as Dave Chappelle once said, the streets have spoken recently to academia and to other places to bring back these questions. And so, whether you call these movements of Black Lives Matter, in South Africa, it was Roads Must Fall, but we should never lose sight to the fact that from Du Bois to Angela Davis to different times, there has always been a consistent movement resisting colonial power. That long-term perspective, if I called it, allows us to breathe. And it also allows us to confront, to have courage when faced with institutional power. It also gives us a resource to go to when we feel that particular struggles are harder or are tough, or that you cannot confront, for instance, the military, or that change is difficult. That resource is available for us to understand that as scholars, we exist in a continuum, in a long struggle. And in a particular moment, we are given the privilege, or we find ourselves in the privileges where we can intervene. So that's an important one to make. The second point I would say then is this idea that Yves Mudimbe, I would invite all of you to read his book where he talks about the invasion of Africa and confronts the issue of coloniality, but also talks about different ways the colonial library, as he called it, works or functions. And this is not particularly a physical library somewhere. Rather, he says it's the domination of physical space, the reformation of natives' minds, and the integration of local economic histories into Western perspectives. Somebody asked a question and said, are we, using these ideas, even indigenous ideas, to the service of the West? Anyway, yes, I would say to some extent in a debate that we're hearing about climate change, absolutely. The crisis has come to Europeans, and now you have to think, okay, indigenous, but for the capitalistic market to go and, sort of manufacture it for the benefits of the Europeans without thinking about, you have an electric car, but where is the battery coming from, and what makes the battery, and which security threats are going to happen to those communities that are producing, that have, those resources. So that's an example to say that even in terrorism, we see that happening sometimes, terrorism studies, where whenever there's a threat to European way of life or American way of life, we are almost open now to indigenous methods or approaches of organizing or of thinking about these issues. I would say that's a very good point that we need to interrogate, to make sure that we are awake, that we are aware when ideas that of liberation, if I call them that, ideas of epistemic liberation are being used actually to continue the same system. I think it is the scholar Santos, who calls it the cognitive empire, is always sharpening its tools. And Ndulov repeated in his work to sharpen its tools, to understand the new language, the technologies, and where just to continue actually the oppression, to change the habits and the maneuvers of ways of doing things. I still have, I think, 5 minutes, so let me point out something else I found interesting that I would want to encourage in this conversation. Yes, an idea about grants. Actually, who funds all those studies we've talked about? And what are the alternative ways we can fund academic scholarship? Is it just really to do with money, or can we find other ways of thinking about funding if we want to do work that really recognizes the missing voices? Or are there strategies that can be used where, for those who can play the game in academia, when you get a grant, you actually extend it to do more work? And so here, a colleague of mine always tells me, you can do academic work and intellectual work. So you produce an article for the academy, for the system, for survival of your job, but you also spend time doing intellectual work, which is the work that actually does the radical work that you want to do in terrorism studies. So one does not have to be separated from the other. These things can be brought together in a strategic understanding of how to work within the system that we are in. And again, to recognize this, that these hegemonic ideas that we are confronting, short-term or long-term, whether it's in this moment or whether it's in the moment that is coming or the past moment, it's very important to recognize that when we actually confront hegemonic ideas in the North, it has value to other contexts, because these powerful ideas of who is a terrorist, or how terrorism is done, or how it's understood, they travel to other contexts. They travel through policy documents. They travel through trainings of counter-terrorism agencies. They travel through classrooms. They travel through those journals somebody was talking about. They travel, of course, through the media. And now they have a speed travel ticket with the internet. And so, we are really to understand that what we are doing, actually, people's lives are pegged to it. If there is a source of encouragement, I can give any scholar who wants to think about this question, is that this is not a waste of time. I mean, sometimes really people making ridicule that the colonization or Me Too movement or any other movement are just passing, and that no, every time this moment happens, when we have an accent put on this particular debate or that debate, something changes. and we rattle power a little bit. And I think now there's an opening to engage with the broader groups in different strategies, different approaches to really center ideas that actually bring voices that are missing. My last intervention is to ask, though, as we think about our approaches and tools and we read, what library are you reading from? And what partner? Solidarity is key, because otherwise there is mental health issues here, and there is a discouragement, and there is pragmatism of jobs, and there is a, you know, in academia, we are actually privileged, but the privilege is given to few. And so how do we multiply what we have? You know, if you have a position, if you are doing a research project, when you're including people, do you yourself actually reach out to the missing voices? And how do you understand those missing voices and how are you incorporating them? So I will stop there because my time is up, but I'm also happy to answer questions. I didn't go much into the literature, but these are topics I also write on, that I rattle with, and that I'm very much committed to continue to think about. And this is platform itself, Sam, is a form of solidarity and collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mwambari. I think we really acknowledge that you have gone into great length and detail. I want to really apologize to our colleagues from New Zealand. I know I can see some of you may want to go to sleep, but let me give this opportunity to the panelists, at least to take 2 minutes each to respond or just share based on reflections from Dr. Mwambari. So let me start with, no order. Let me see whoever is ready to start. Just 2 minutes. Oh, let's start with prayer. Just the same order.
Hey, thank you. This was really inspiring on many levels. And I actually was just going to move on to the next person because I want to reflect upon some of the things that was said rather than commenting myself and see if there's any questions from anybody else and so on. So I'll just stop and say thank you.
All right, thanks very much. Rabea, do you have something to?
Yeah, should we collect a couple more questions because I feel similarly to Priya before I actually reflect a bit more in detail.
All right. Aiden Ahmed.
I agree with Bria and Rabia and think we should give voices to the audience as well.
All right. Let the voice of the people not be silenced at this point, and therefore I will open the floor for questions and answers. You may just show a sign of raising up your hand on the screen and we will give you the chance, or just type straight your question into the chat box. So welcome, question and answers, please. And you may want to specify whom you are asking, or if it's a general question, we will see if anyone else can pick it. The floor is open to the participants. Right, Tom.
Hey, thank you everyone so much. That was a really interesting discussion, and thanks Alice and crew for putting the conversation together. My question was aimed primarily at Priya, but I'm interested in other people's thoughts as well. Priya, especially, you said that you have kind of come to this conversation with just loads of questions, but I wonder if you could just expand on any thoughts or kind of directions in which your thinking has moved as you've been pondering our complicity in the academy with logics of and histories of colonialism. Yeah, I'd just kind of be interested in your thoughts, and then other people's thoughts as well on that. Like, how do we justify? Do we justify? How do we justify ourselves in these positions?
Allow me to take 3 questions before we get responses. So, Elias, then Alice.
Hiya, many thanks for organizing this presentation. It's been a long time in waiting that somebody has managed to organize something on terrorism and decoloniality. So I sort of introduced myself. I work in terrorism. I work at the University of London. Not London, that's my previous university in Liverpool, but I'm based in Singapore. So I kind of have a interesting outlook to looking at terrorism from a part of the world that was colonized. Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Dutch and British colonies, Australia not far away, New Zealand not far away, coming from the UK. So I have a kind of interesting perspective of how terrorism actually operates within what we call the global south, and how, for example, some of the, well, all the strategies that we employ in the global north were refined in the global south and then taken to the global north. So my sort of, and I've been working on decoloniality for a while now, writing on it and someone talking on it. I'm very pessimistic about decoloniality, purely from the fact that just even analyzing the journals, even critical terrorism journals, only one article published on decoloniality. That was by Shirley, and I think, presume yourself. Definitely by Shirley, I've just seen a name there. One article since Road Must Fall was 2005, and we are what, 2022 or something. So one article, which is quite shocking, I would say. But then I would sort of question the appetite amongst amongst terrorism scholars to actually engage in decoloniality. Because what it seems to me, and even this conversation, not to be too critical, is that the conversation is between the West and the West, generally. Theoretically, politically, we keep talking about the West to the West, and every, this may sound like a ramble, but maybe some use in this as well. So every talk I've listened to and so on, it has been between the West and the West, really. There's not been, for example, a talk between the West and Southeast Asia. Given the fact Southeast Asia has lots of academics historically working on sort of decolonizing things, and suppose same with Africa, but it seems to me that Western academia is in many ways colonizing decolonization, which is really a problem if you look at it in terms of decoloniality. And one example I like to sort of, is a brief example, but I think it's quite important to bring. When we look at the timing of our seminars, webinars, yeah, and it came across to me because my colleague, Dr. Leon Masabi, organized, he's doing a series on decoloniality and was inviting quite a few scholars. And we were talking about this, and he said that he got a lot of complaints from scholars from the UK about the timing, because the timing of the webinars is Singapore time. But scholars from Europe are complaining the fact that it's not European time, which is really interesting, because it leads me to something that's really important, is the colonized mind, which I think somebody brought up, the colonized mind. And I think every one of us, whether we're working in terrorism, international relations, peace building, sociology, psychology, doesn't matter, where we live in the global south, global north, global east, global west, we have a colonized mind. And what I've realized is that that's not really being touched upon within the conversations that we've been having. It's really important that we touch upon that. And Dr. Msawi touched on the library. One of the problems with the library is the fact that it's a colonized library, and we walk around with the colonized library. So when we engage in decoloniality, we are engaging from a very colonized mind. So the question has to be asked, can we really decolonize something that is, we are products of a colonized system? And then Rabbi mentioned something interesting about friendly decolonizing. And I absolutely agree, Rabbi, is that a lot of the initiatives that we have, decolonize the curriculum, theories, also, they're just friendly, and all they do is reproduce coloniality. Even the university reproduces coloniality. Sorry, just the last point. And what I would suggest is that what we need to do is have a radical break. We need to use decoloniality to get to a decolonial or decolonized epistemology about terrorism. And that's my question really probably is, how do we get there? Can we get there? And I think that's the most important.
Elias, thanks so much. Elias, thanks so much. At least, it's very clear now. At least, and the rest now we might just need to be very concise, so that at least our panelists also spend a little time. All right, Alice.
Yep, thank you very much, Sam. Thanks to all panelists and also David. It was absolutely fantastic. I just have two questions. One for Rabia. I wondered how you work, Rabia, but also maybe others if they want to talk about it as well. How do you work with feminism in your work? And I wondered if you could talk a bit more about that and how maybe that would also help us think past like limitations of CTS, but also its relationship with decoloniality. And then also I had a question for Ahmed. I really loved your presentation. I think it's really fantastic to think about kind of like alternative local fictions. And I was wondering, to kind of help us to rethink the archive, I was wondering, how can we also acknowledge that these local forms of knowledge produce their own norms that are often gendered and classed and racialized as well themselves? And how do we hold those things in tension with colonialism? Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Can we get a response now from the panel? Whoever's ready.
In order as well? Yeah.
All right, now let's go proceed.
Oh, okay.
David?
Sorry. So who's proceeding? Shit, I can just go.
Oh, Priya, proceed. You have already started.
Sorry, was somebody else about to? Sorry. I don't know what's going on apparently, which is
Okay, sorry, don't worry. Go ahead.
But thank you very much for this and for the questions. And it was, so our complicities with the histories of colonialism, what do we do about it? And I think part of it might be to just use some of what folks around here were already talking about much better than I did, to talk about how perhaps this is about, you know, a different kind of epistemology, etc. But personally, I've been looking at mainly, I think, again, drawing from what one of you talked about, looking at how terrorism is talked about in the US at the moment, and the ways in which we don't talk about certain kinds of acts as terrorism, and how that might fit into broader discussions of white innocence, as it were, which is what Nadia Ali talks about in a different context as well, and how that creates this idea that, you know, it's only certain people and certain types of violence that can be considered terrorism, and whether we can challenge that and question that somehow. And I'm not making very much sense, I realize, but it's something that I've been thinking about, but also some of the things that was just said in this panel has expanded those thoughts. So I shall stop there before I become even more incoherent. Thank you.
David?
Sorry, did someone say?
Did you say David or?
David.
Yes, okay. No, just two quick points. One that, Alice, I appreciate that idea about intersectionality, and that's something I had on my list actually, that we had less discussion on that. And I would encourage everybody to really read and reflect more on working on intersectionality. There's a very good book by Sylvia Tamale that actually, in its first introduction, you are going to have a very good understanding and discussion of scholarship on decolonization. And she tries to provide that intersectional analysis of Afrofeminism and decolonization debates. The second book literature I would like to recommend highly, again, introduction, is Epistemic Freedom in Africa. Even though it is on Africa, the Ndlovu Gisheni, in the first introduction, again, introduces you to scholarship, to have that long-term, long purview of the literature. And from there, I think you have quite a bit. And methodologically, Smith, you know, Smith, I think 1999, on indigenous methods, and Chelicia, Universal Botswana, if you just type that, or I'll put these works here. Those almost 3-4 texts will help us think very much on practical ways of decolonizing research methods, or even how we do research, or how we think about it, how we work with those missing voices, how we bring them in, but also it gives us an idea about intersectionality. And then Elias, very quickly, is it Elias? Is the one I have on the name. I really feel you, but I think in the moments of reflecting on decolonization and always thinking about power or how to confront power, I think there is room for lamenting. I think there's room to express optimism or what did you call it? What is the
Pessimistic.
Yes, you know, there is room for all that, because through that sometimes it allows us to move on then and engage. I actually thought the same in 2020 because there were so many talks I attended on decolonization that I almost got saturated and I stopped. But I did my second master's in Pan-African studies on these ideas of decolonization at Syracuse and in Kenya, and had did my PhD in Australia. So I already knew these ideas were in circulation. It's not true that some people want to present as new or they're discovering something. And so one of the things I wrote in my to answer myself in that lamenting moment is a short piece I'm going to post here that is called can these platforms, these technology platforms, be a way of passing on ideas of liberation? And in that I did with a lot of talks that were actually given on what you call global north, or let me say Europe, America, but also connecting to those that were given in Africa or Asia. And I had to really go back to the library and make that short piece for anybody who would be interested to know that this was not new, but what were the new themes and in what ways are these decolonized ideas helping us in this moment in the 21st century. And I'll post that short piece here just to increase the sense of optimism in you that we are making a movement and we are moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It will always be good to lament, be optimistic and pessimistic, and that is knowledge. Rabia?
Right, thank you. Yeah, honestly, I really appreciate this call for optimism, David, because I did and I still do echo a lot of Ilias's concerns in terms of well, I am more on the pessimistic side, I guess, but I love to hear more optimistic voices, and this is what we need if we want to get anywhere with a more decolonial mission, as I would call it. And yeah, so I mean, one of the things that I was also thinking when I was when some of my friends actually asked, oh, can they attend this this session because they'd be interested, and I had to tell them, well, actually, you have to be a member, you have to pay. And that's like kind of, it's a bit embarrassing because if you say, well, this is a decolonial, this is a panel on decolonization and indigenous perspectives, this is really against the decolonial ethos, right? So, and that again echoes what Ilias has said, like we are really just stuck in these structures. We want to do a decolonial work, and yet we are part of this academy that is just so colonial in so many ways. But yeah, just to reply very quickly to Alice's question, feminism, very, very interesting question, because I have a very complicated relationship with feminism, if I can say that. I have a complicated relationship with it because I am using a feminist approach in my definition, but I found feminist circles in academia, sometimes exclusive, very often very white, and very often, and they've also started co-opting the whole intersectionality movement and using that language a lot, also using decoloniality in that language. They're just very often putting everything under their sort of umbrella and say, like, well, we're feminists, so we ought to do that just by default. And that's what I had a problem with. So I chose not to actually call this a feminist approach, what I was using in my thesis. And I called it the gender coloniality because I find that the way the West has constructed the idea of gender is a very Western one. It's a colonial one. So, and it's an element of coloniality. And it's even more than that. It's kind of like our language is literally structured in gendered terms, in binary terms, right? Even the binary between religion and secular, that's something that I wrote about, right, with religious terrorism, is a gendered one. So religion in colonial modernity is a feminized concept, really. And so much, and even terrorism is a feminized concept if we think about it in those terms. And that's why, and I found that very useful, that kind of thinking and looking at it and how these gender identities are part of the very concepts that we're analyzing. So I thought it was very important that I do work with that, but I chose not to call it explicitly feminist, right? But rather stick with my decolonial framework. And that's also because post-structural theory, for example, and post-structural feminists, they have pointed to how gender on a more macro level matters in international relations, but they have failed to admit that's a colonial gender identity and a colonial idea of gender that matters on that level. So yeah, I hope that gives you an idea of how I've used it.
All right, thanks. Ahmed, if you could respond to question by Alice.
Yes, and Elias as well, if I mispronounce.
Yes, right, yes.
I think there is something in common in the whole conversation today, or the whole conversation about decoloniality in general, which is violence and repression. Like, if we talk about colonialism as a practice and colonialism as a discourse or a narrative, the logic itself is still embedded in every institution, every aspect of our life. It's not only academia. And by decolonizing that, you are fighting against violence, which will not be allowed, will not be welcomed, and we will be counter-resist. So, for example, when Rabia talk about to what extent this is a decoloniality of the curriculum or it's a diversity. So what if you bring some voices from the global south? It is still teaching the same methods, the same methodologies, the same way of thinking. Even like when you, for example, you bring feminism and post-colonial and decolonial in week 15, after 15th of week of realism, neoliberalism, constructive, same. So the students, which will be tomorrow's scholar, already filled with realism for 15 weeks. You're trying to bring, you're drilling up to like think about critical. The other things, it's about how we study, Elias again and Alice, how we study this without the West. And also, this is a very complicated issue because, again, if I want to publish in political violence or international security, I need to speak the language they speak. So, for example, I think many of you are familiar, I'm working with Ibn Khaldun. I have a correspondence. I will put it in my book, who's Ibn Khaldun is. And this is from International Journal of Middle Eastern Studies. So you will have a conversation about who is this and who is that, because it's not Stuart Mill, it's not Hobbes, it's not Hegel. So you are fighting not only about representation, about giving voices, you are fighting this domination of knowledge. That's why I know sometimes, that's why I said it's a radical intervention, it's radical engagement. When you use concept like epistemic violence, epistemic operation, and even Golera and Deleuze, when she said linguistic terror about the English, like many review about the publication, Critical Terrorism Studies, whatever, all the review articles are in English, and English is 15% of the globe. What about the 85% of people who speak other language? They are not even exist for this canon academia. About the literature, Ali, thank you very much. One of the things, again, when I struggled to get access to the archive, and on the other hand, really deeply, embeddedly rigid discipline, international politics and political science, look at the literature about comparative literature or about language or about even sociology, like James Scott and Bondi from, I think, Subaltern School in India, they talk about fragmentation of memory. So you're talking about poetry, you're talking about statement, you're talking about folklore. This is narratives that fall within the cracks, like it's not exist in the archive, and it was narrated and inherited and traveled, to use Edward Said, through time and through space. It is still there, but it's outside the formal or state archive. But it telling the story of the people. Like, why we forget that the whole idea behind Subaltern School, it's about these people who are not a part of the British archive. So we bring back these stories, and it's not stories, but because the dominant academia institution call it stories, but it's a history, but from below. By bringing these voices, and I put it in a conversation with the dominant and formal narrative we will see the counterpoint here. Well, what exactly this style of life, what Napoleon and the British colonialism in Egypt and North Africa trying to tell us, and what is the people history themselves said, experience, resist, express their emotion as well. Like Khalid Fahmy deconstructs the whole narrative of Egyptian history school when he wrote about Muhammad Ali from the perspective of the soldiers. I think it's not about optimistic. Last point, it's not about being optimistic or being pessimistic. Actually, it's a long journey. We really need to look at it serious if we want really to escape from this prisoners that called colonial mind or colonial logic. Thank you.
Thanks, Ahmed. I think we are closing in almost the next 5 or so minutes. I want to give the last 2 questions. I've seen Shali. Do we have any other person that wants to ask a question? Fine, let's get the question from Shali and then we will be just wrapping up. So I'll beg those who may want to leave just to give us 5 good minutes and we're done.
Thank you, Sam. Can you hear me?
Yep, perfectly right.
Oh yeah, really wonderful sentiments from the presenters who've spoken today. And thank you for giving me this opportunity. In New Zealand right now, it's going to 3 a.m. So I'll just try to focus. But I'm really happy with all the sentiments that have been said today. But the big question that I have is that I have a big problem with the issue of trying to present indigenous knowledge as if it is a supplement to Western knowledge. It's as if we are asking for the bare minimum. This is a question to Ahmed. How do we stop this notion, talking about epistemic violence and the westernizing, knowledges? How do we present indigenous knowledge so that it participates equally with Western knowledge, so that it's not like it's a supplement, that is, we're just asking for the bare minimum about, including missing voices in, terrorism research in this epistemic space. We need an equal participation of indigenous knowledge, just in the same, epistemic space that Western knowledge is also participating. How do we do that?
Thanks, Ahmed. Ahmed, you can do it quite quickly, and then I will give the last moment, just 1 minute also to Aidan to actually say one more word, then we close up.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you very much, really. Thank you very much. It's very easy. Just do it. I'm sorry. This is recorded, so it's fine. I don't listen to anyone telling me you can't do that. I'm really sorry. It's arrogant. It's not polite to say it, but that's the issue. I found indigenous knowledge, and I don't call it indigenous, to be honest, because it will take us to the culture, particularity and stuff. But knowledge is not a Western invention. Again, we need to remember that knowledge is not a Western invention. Everyone has the right to agree or disagree. I found certain scholars from Ghana to Biro to back to Nepal or South India, and they make sense to me. I am not interested in Foucault, and I said it every time. I'm not interested in Foucault. I'm not interested in Bourdieu. I'm not interested in any modern Western scholar. I'm interested with people coming from the region, have something to say. And it's epistemic position. It's not a personal, a culture, or it's a positionality. It's epistemic position. I have someone found it in the archive, and it's still valid until today. I'm not bringing back Ibn Khaldun, because it seems I have to discipline Ibn Khaldun to Western academia. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in other form of knowledge, which will give everyone a voice to be represented, to be equal and be treated equal in academia. if we want to escape, because again, everyone talk about escape colonialism, but we still stuck in the same circle, like we still reproducing and recycling everything. Even from critical view, we need new things, and we really need to go beyond our very narrow and niche discipline. Read something else, read something beyond political science, read something beyond critical terrorism studies. Bring everything, Edward Said, Fanon, Gloria Allendays, everyone, bring in anyone new. It's really fresh, and that's a problem with social science in general. We are in our boxes and we just talking to ourselves. Elias kindly said it, it's not a dialogue, it's a monologue. The West is talking to the West. If I have a conversation in Arab world, we will not talk about the West by any chance. We talk to ourselves about ourselves. And I think we need to stop that by bringing these new voices from all over the world and just put it as a de facto. This is what I have, and you get published and it would be recognized.
Thanks, Ahmed. I want to request Aidan to make a few comments, because we've not had any direct question to him, but I think you can have at least a comment to any of the questions that have been asked. Aidan?
Big call, but thank you again. And I've just been trying to take notes the whole time, because this is a really interesting discussion, and I feel like I timed my own presentation so well, so wrong, so I didn't quite get to the end. But really, what I wanted to end up with was sort of my own positionality and wondering, what is the space for white scholars like myself in this space. Not that decoloniality excludes necessarily particular people. But how can we, assist, or do we need to assist? What is it that, people like myself or Oliver Richmond or Richard Jackson and these things should be doing? And I keep coming back to, we don't necessarily need to look to the local or the indigenous to create an alternative. We should be able to imagine new futures that are radical, built on, gendered pacifist lenses or decolonial approaches ourselves, without necessarily going in and trying to co-opt some other knowledge or saying that it came from this space and therefore it's more organic and local. So really, the only thing I really feel like I can add here is, and to pick up on David's point, playing the game is really important, playing the academic game. I'm trying to, I'm just getting into it myself. But I think really the space where most of us have the biggest impact or the ability to influence anything or share our ideas is actually outside of the academic institution, or at least through teaching. So using modern technologies, not necessarily Twitter, but blogs and spaces where you can actually have a collective narrative that is cumulative, so people can follow your trajectory and your ideas, is infinitely more important to being able to understand a particular person and where they're coming from than a 160-word tweet or whatever. So I think these spaces are really, really great. I just followed like a bunch of you now. So I'm looking forward to sort of trying to figure out where you're going, but it's all amazing. And thank you very much for having me.
All right, thank you so much. I'm so excited that at least the engagement has been really, really candid. And I want to say that our panelists, you've done us proud, and everyone else who have been participating. We want to say thank you so much. Thanks also to David, who has been a very robust discussant, and thanks everyone for the questions and for the team that had been organizing this. I may want to ask Tom if he might be having any announcement. Otherwise, I'll give it to Alice to close for us. So Tom, do you have anything?
No, no, not at all.
Thank you so much. Then Alice, please, as a convener, go ahead to do the wrapping up, and we close officially.
Okay, sure, Sam. Thank you very much. Yeah, just to echo everything that Sam put much more eloquently than I can. I'm so excited. I was so excited to attend this, and it was just blown everything out of the water. I think it's been a fantastic discussion. Yeah, and we couldn't have hoped for more. So thank you all for joining us, and everyone else for coming to listen. All of our amazing panelists, David. I want to just remind everyone about the solidarity statement with Palestine that Ahmed brought up at the beginning. I think that's maybe one of the examples that Aidan was just reminding us of just now. Yeah, so we're going to have our next our next panel in January. So just stay tuned for that, and hopefully we'll be able to make it free for everyone at some point as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We say have a good week to all.
You too. Bye, everyone.
Bye.